Just before we get started, I'll just take a moment to mention now that we're well into the semester with tutorials and lectures, and you've submitted 2 assessment tasks. You all know that at the end of the semester you have this formal process of student evaluation of teaching in which you're invited to offer feedback on any aspect of the course. I'd just like informally to let you know that I'm kind of willing and eager to receive that kind of feedback as the course is going. So if there's anything about how things are happening in lectures or tutorials or assessments that you want to sort of say is working for you or not working for you, or ideas about how it could be done differently and how that might benefit you, that's useful feedback for me. I can't promise that I'll just implement changes left and right, but it's useful to hear from you at any stage of the semester about how things are going. So please don't hesitate to get in contact with me about that sort of stuff. Yeah, okay, I just wanted to mention that now. So let's talk about consequentialism. Does anyone want to hazard a guess at what the picture up there on the screen is a picture of? Yeah?
Nagasaki.
It's Nagasaki. It's one of the 2 Japanese cities that was bombed by the Allies at the end of World War II. So some of you will have studied this, others of you won't. Rough details, the Japanese military and the Emperor had basically signalled to the Allies that there was no way that they were going to surrender. The Allies had developed these early nuclear weapons that could destroy whole cities, and they thought this is the best way to bring the war to an end, is to destroy 2 cities, show the Japanese army that we've got, you know, weapons that are completely outstripping theirs, and that will force a surrender, and indeed it did. But roughly 200,000 civilians were killed in these attacks. So although certainly some people in, you know, Western culture, countries that were part of this alliance in World War II, are critical of the way that we fought that war, generally speaking, we're not rising up and revolting against our governments. We don't talk about World War II as if it was a wildly unjust escapade. Indeed, it's characteristically identified as a just war, the kind of war where we were justified in fighting the kind of battles we were fighting. So why are we okay with this? Those of us who are okay with it, killing 200,000 innocent civilians. Well, the rough answer is, the justification that's usually put forward when this question arises is, it was the least worst option under the circumstances. So fighting a series of battles and an attempt to occupy Japanese territory using conventional weapons, given that the Japanese had firmly indicated their unwillingness to surrender, so the argument goes, would have resulted in many, many more than 200,000 people being killed, would have resulted in millions of people being killed, military and civilians alike, right? So this kind of reasoning, we sometimes describe it by saying the ends justify the means. It's a way of thinking about ethical situations where sometimes you've got to do bad things, really bad things, like killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people in order to prevent even worse things. When we say it that way, when we say you're thinking like the ends justify the means, often we're expressing it that way in order to criticize the way that someone's approaching an ethical issue, right? Yes, you're acting as if the ends justify the means. The ends don't justify the means. Consequentialism is an ethical theory that not only kind of tolerates the idea of the ends justifying the means, but actually asserts it and promotes that idea, right? Consequentialists are people who think right actions are ones that are all about whether or not we achieve better or worse outcomes. You might have to do appalling things sometimes in order to achieve better outcomes. But if you really are achieving better outcomes, consequentialists want to say that you're justified in pursuing that course of action. So that's the family of views that we're going to be focusing on this week and next week. I'm going to start off today by just giving you some basic ideas and definitions and looking at different kinds of consequentialist thought, talking about theories of intrinsic goodness and the way that they play a central role in underpinning consequentialist frameworks, talk briefly about a few of the things that have made consequentialism an attractive ethical theory to many people over the last couple of hundred years, and then finish with starting to kind of critically delve into consequentialist thought and raise some problems for it. Next week's lecture will be entirely focused on problems for consequentialism. Today that's just going to come up briefly at the end. Now, I gave this lecture at Caulfield this morning and ran a little bit over time. If we are running out of time today, we might have to sort of point 4 might get bumped into next week, but we'll see how we go. Okay, does someone want to start us off by having a go, someone who's feeling confident and brave, at describing what an ethical theory is? This came up very briefly in lecture 1. We haven't given it much attention. Does anyone want to have a guess? Yeah?
A system of ethical axioms that will explain
Yeah, pretty good. That's a pretty good answer. So the key points I want to pick out there is that it's systematic, and ethical theory gives us like a whole kind of theory or system of principles or axioms for how we should think about ethics. It's supposed to be explanatory, as this gentleman said. It's supposed to explain why we reach the same judgments or different judgments on a series of cases. And also it's supposed to help us think about hard cases and resolve ethical disagreements. The most simple way to summarize this would be to say an ethical theory is a set of principles that tries to explain why certain actions are right and other actions are wrong. Now, in the first 5 weeks of this course, we've been talking about lots of different kinds of views, like ethical realism and non-cognitivism and psychological egoism and sentimentalism. Are those ethical theories? No, they're not ethical theories. They're not trying to explain why some actions are right and other actions are wrong. They're meta-ethical principles or meta-ethical theses. All of these views that we've been looking at in the first 5 weeks are kind of theses about what kind of a thing is ethics? What is our subject matter in ethics? What are we doing when we make ethical judgment? What we're going to be looking at now for the next 6 weeks is different kinds of ethical theories, different attempts not to answer these ethical questions on that meta-ethical level, but on the level of, we've got all these ethical judgments, what knits them together? What makes them coherent? What story are we going to tell about why, we all think that it's wrong to be cruel to animals and that you ought to be kind to your family members and that you ought not to betray your friends? What's unifying all of these different ethical judgments? If we don't have any theory that unifies those ethical judgments, then the judgments look a little bit arbitrary and conventional. Think about if you encounter an unorthodox religious worldview, like Scientology or something, and there are all these rules that you don't really understand. Why do you have this rule and this rule and this rule? Like, you have to do this thing on special occasions, but most of the time, and you have to marry these people. It can all look completely arbitrary and conventional. If it turns out that our ethical judgments, all of those thoughts we have about not being cruel to animals, doing what your family, being kind to your family, not betraying your friends, if we don't have some systematic story that makes all of that coherent and that explains why the judgments stack up the way they do, then ethics itself just starts to look like a series of arbitrary conventions. So indirectly then, this question about what ethical theory should we follow has implications for how we think about ethical realism, right? If we start to suspect that our ethical judgments are just a bunch of arbitrary conventions and there's no theory that explains them, then that's going to make it harder to be an ethical realist, right? Because the objectivity that we want out of ethics looks really implausible once it just seems like a set of arbitrary conventions. So the question we want to ask is, which ethical theory is the best ethical theory? There are a bunch of different candidates on the table. Consequentialism is the one we'll be looking at this week and next week, but we'll be looking at rival theories in later weeks. To decide which theory is the best theory, we need to think about what makes a theory good and what makes a theory bad. So some of the theoretical desiderata that are going to be in play when we ask these questions include coherence and consistency. A theory that just contradicts itself seems like a bad theory. Empirical plausibility. Let me give you like a really silly example. Suppose someone said, what's your ethical theory? What explains why all the right actions are right and all the wrong actions are wrong? It's like, oh, well, the right actions are the ones that the ethical angels that sit on your shoulder and whisper in your ear and tell you what to do. The right actions are the ones that the ethical angels tell you to do. And you're like, that seems like a bad theory because I'm pretty sure ethical angels don't exist, right? If your ethical theory makes empirical claims or claims about the natural world that are implausible or for which we have no evidence, then that seems like a problem for an ethical theory. So one thing we want out of our theory is that it's not making sort of implausible or unevidenced claims about the natural world. Kind of related to that, we want our ethical theory to have a sort of correspondence to human dispositions. We want it to be the kind of theory or set of principles that beings like us could plausibly follow, right? So if you had an ethical theory that says, oh, you should always just make things perfect, right? That's not a very good ethical theory because we can't productively respond to that advice. Oh, I'll just make things perfect. That's not useful advice. We need an ethical theory that kind of answers the questions that arise for us in a way that we can respond to kind of thoughtfully and productively. Now, the next 3 or 4 points I'm going to put question marks next to, just to signal that these are things that proponents of different ethical theories disagree about whether these are things that we want out of our ethical theory. So demandingness. What do I mean by demandingness? Suppose you had an ethical theory that said, well, right action is basically just doing whatever comes naturally, It's a really undemanding ethical theory. It's really easy to act rightly if all you have to do to act rightly is just do what comes naturally, right? Many people have thought our ethical theory has to demand a bit more of us than that. It has to set challenges. It has to try to provoke us into trying to live better lives and be better people. At the same time, there's this worry that we don't want our theory to be over-demanding. Remember in week 1 we looked at this article by Peter Singer where he was defending the view that basically every dollar that you have that's not being spent on bare necessities, you should give away to people less fortunate than yourself. And this kind of thinking, which comes up a lot in consequentialist views, looks so demanding that almost none of us are ever going to actually be able to live up to that standard. And some people have thought an ethical theory is no good to us if it sets standards that we couldn't possibly live up to. It kind of relates to that ought implies can thought that we discussed in connection with psychological egoism. So we want it to be demanding, but not too demanding. It's kind of like a Goldilocks principle, right? Not too soft, not too hard. You want the principles to be just right. Alignment with ethical intuitions. We have a lot of settled ethical judgments about lots and lots of different things, about relationships, about violence, about psychological dispositions like cruelty or kindness. And to at least some degree, we want our ethical theory to give us the right results, give us the right answers. If our ethical theory tells us that all of our settled moral judgments are completely wrong, then it's just going to look obviously implausible. It's going to look like it's completely out of sync with the way that we normally come to these questions. And lastly, you might think that simplicity is a good thing in a theory. In the natural sciences, it's this general kind of theoretical desideratum that you should make your theory as simple as possible. It's an idea a bit like Occam's razor. Don't have a theory that's any more complex than it needs to be to explain the things that it's trying to explain. So if something similar applies in ethics, then that's going to have implications for which theory we choose. Right, so this is what we're going to be, this is the space we're going to be in over the next 6 weeks, looking at different kinds of theories and how they stack up against each other, thinking about all of these different kinds of theoretical ideals or theoretical desiderata. Okay, so just to give you a definition of what our subject matter is for today and tomorrow, consequentialist ethical theories are the theories that, really it's a very simple family of theories. They say the right actions are right because they promote good outcomes and the wrong actions are wrong because they promote bad outcomes. That's slightly oversimplified, but that's pretty much the gist of it. And I mean, the other thing that just needs to be appended there is to say, and that's all. When we're judging right and wrong action, it's exclusively determined by its relationship to promoting good or bad outcomes. There's nothing else that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about right and wrong action. So this compares to a couple of main rival theories, which we'll be talking about in later weeks. Deontological theories, which say that some actions are right irrespective of the consequences, some actions are inherently right, and some actions are wrong irrespective of the consequences. Right? So maybe there are certain rights which, even if infringing that right would lead to better outcomes, it's always wrong to infringe against that right. That's a standard thought in deontology, one that consequentialists reject. And then the other main rival tradition is the virtue ethical tradition. Virtue ethical theories say that right or wrong actions are about whether you're acting in accordance with virtue or vice. Virtues being things like kindness or courage or generosity or loyalty. Vices being things like cruelty. So virtue ethical theories take the emphasis off the consequences, off the inherent nature of the act, and focus in on the mindset or the dispositions that are manifested in the actor, him or herself. All right, very briefly, I just want you to buddy up with the 2 or 3 people in your immediate vicinity and see if you can come up with a quick answer to the following question. What are some cases in which consequentialists are going to disagree with proponents of these rival views, specific kinds of cases where they're going to disagree about what the proper course of action is? The people on this side of the room, I want you to think about cases where consequentialists and deontologists are going to disagree. And the people on this side of the room, I want you to think about cases where consequentialists and virtue ethicists are going to disagree. I've just given you some very simple definitions, so I want to see what you can come up with. We'll take like literally 2 minutes, so go, quick. Go on. Get him on. All right, I know that's not nearly enough time, but maybe that's enough time for you to have come up with some answers. So I'm gonna call on people who haven't yet any time this semester in the lectures spoken up. So people who've been sitting there quietly thinking good ideas but not speaking. Someone over this side of the room who hasn't yet had a go at any speaking in the lectures yet this semester. Could you think of a case where deontological theories and consequentialist theories are going to divide on what we ought to do? Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's right, but you know the situation with the Batman, you got to push him down in order to save three people?
Yep.
Well, that would be if you pushed him, that would be violating his right to life.
Yep.
So the deontological group would say, no, don't do that. Consequentialists would say you're saving three people at the cost of one.
Yep.
You should push him down.
Yeah, good. So there's lots of cases like this that involve sacrificing or using a particular person in order to benefit other people, where the consequentialists are going to kind of tally up the cost to this person against the benefits to these people, and at least sometimes they're going to say, yeah, you should sacrifice this person for the sake of these others. Whereas deontologists are going to have, at least in some cases, absolute categorical prohibitions, where they'll say, even if you would benefit those people more, you shouldn't use or exploit one person to benefit others. Okay, over this side of the room. Again, someone who hasn't spoken up in any of the lectures yet this semester, any thoughts about cases where virtue ethicists and consequentialists are going to disagree?
If there's some sort of free company who wants to save money so that they don't have to pay tax or something, so they give away some money to charity so that they can get a different tax bracket or something.
Yep.
The consequentialist would say that's awesome, money to charity would.
Good. Yeah, good. I'm not sure if everyone heard that. The idea was that you could have a company that's trying to basically minimize its tax burden and is coming up with clever structures that minimize the tax it pays, but part of that is giving money to charities that do a lot of good. And the motive that's driving the decision might be basically greed, something vicious, but the outcome of the choice has all of these benefits, which from the consequentialist point of view are good. So the consequentialist is going to say, good, that was a right action. The virtue ethicist will say, no, you are manifesting vice. The other example that I like to give of this is, imagine you've got some organization that's got a really noble, altruistic purpose, like an NGO that's all about inoculating people in developing countries against infectious diseases. And you've got like two versions of this organization. One of them is headed up by a characteristically virtuous person who's patient and generous and kind of easygoing and kind and nice. And the other is headed up by just a ruthless bastard who bullies people and is like, you know, will throw other people under the bus in order to get the outcome that they want. We can easily imagine that the version of that organization that's headed up by the ruthless person is going to achieve better outcomes in terms of the goals of the organization, inoculating people against infectious diseases. Because sometimes being a ruthless bastard actually gets stuff done, right? The virtue ethicist is going to look at that and be horrified and say, that's really, really vicious. Being unkind, being ungenerous, impatient, that's vicious action, that's wrong action. Where the consequentialist is going to say, well, if you want to make an omelette, sometimes you have to crack eggs, right? And being vicious in that case gets us better consequences. So that just gives you a bit of a sense of how proponents of these different views are going to look at things differently. Consequentialists, the consistent pattern is they'll always say, none of that other stuff matters. Respecting people's rights, look, if violating their rights gets you a better outcome, violate. Being virtuous, forget it. If being vicious gets you a better outcome, be vicious. It's always about promoting the best consequences. There's some complications that will crop up as we go along, but that's the essence of the difference. Okay, so here's a little example from the brief extract from Jack Smart, which is kind of a bit cute and trivial, but I wanted to include it because I think it's nice. So Smart says, suppose I have promised a dying man on a desert island from which subsequently I alone am rescued to give his hoard of gold to the South Australian Jockey Club. On my return, I give it to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, which we may suppose badly needs it for a new x-ray machine. Unsurprisingly, Smart was working at the University of Adelaide when he wrote this. He wasn't just obsessed with South Australia. Could anybody deny that I had done rightly without being open to the charge of heartlessness? Think of the persons dying of painful tumours who could have been saved by the desert island goal. Now, obviously, in a case like that, it's really easy to think the same way that Smart's thinking about it. Yeah, promise to some random person you wound up on a desert island with. Once that person's gone, yeah, maybe it's a nice idea to keep your promises, but are you really going to let people die of tumours just for the sake of keeping your promises? You really shouldn't. You should worry more about the tumours than keeping your promise. But then, of course, what Smart wants to say is that that's how we should think ethically about pretty much every situation we ever encounter. It's always about following the course of action that puts the consequences first, and all that other stuff doesn't really come into it. Okay. You're a consequentialist if you think that what matters in assessing right and wrong action is the consequences and nothing else. But what count as good consequences, of course, different people might have different views about this. Some people will think that human happiness is the most important thing. Other people will think that seeing God's will done on earth is the most important thing. Other people will think that beauty is the most important thing. If you're a consequentialist, you need to think separately about your theory of the good and then your theory of the right, which is parasitic on your theory of the good. So if I'm a classical utilitarian, I'll say a little bit more about those guys in a minute, and I think that what's good is pleasure and what's bad is pain, then that's the foundational thing in my ethical theory, a theory of what's good and bad. And then my account of right and wrong action just parasitically refers to that theory of the good. Right? Because my theory of right action says you should just act in whatever way best promotes the good and minimizes the bad. Right? So the theory of the good comes first, and then the theory of right action just follows on from that. And one clarification about how we're supposed to respond to the good, if you're a consequentialist, it's about promoting the good, as distinct from honouring or respecting the good. So what does this mean? Well, think again of the case that involves like sacrificing a person's life to save another person's life. If you're the kind of consequentialist who thinks that what matters most is like human welfare and human flourishing, promoting the good might mean murdering one person to save 3 lives. But honouring that good, honouring human life, might discourage you from committing such a sacrifice, right? Sometimes when you honour something or you respect something, you're not willing to do a bad thing now for the sake of a better outcome later. That's inconsistent with respecting that good or honouring it, right? But consequentialists are going to want to say it's not about respecting or honouring, it's about promoting the good. It's about calculating costs and benefits and pursuing whichever course of action would get more of it. So sometimes you should dishonour the very ideals that you subscribe to in order to better promote them. Does that make sense? You're someone who really cares about human life. You dishonour that commitment by killing someone, but in dishonouring it, you promote an outcome, saving 5 lives, that's kind of maximising the good that you care about. Another clarification, people who subscribe to deontology or virtue ethics, it's not like they don't think the consequences matter at all, right? They're still paying attention to how their actions are likely to play out. They still care about this stuff, but they care about other things as well. Virtue ethicists care about consequences, and they also care about acting virtuously. Deontologists care about consequences, but they also care about respecting people's rights. What makes you a consequentialist, or what's distinctive about being a consequentialist, is that you think consequences matter, and that's all. Nothing else comes into it. Okay. Now, here's a different kind of question. We've got to promote the good, fine. But how are we supposed to promote the good? Are we supposed to try to maximize the good, or are we just supposed to do something to nudge it along? Traditionally, consequentialists have thought about this in the maximizing way. You should do whatever maximizes the good, has been the way they've normally responded to that question. But you can see how some difficulties are going to arise if you think that you should always try to maximize the good. Because we wouldn't all be here now if we were concerned about maximizing the good, right? Every second of our life would be devoted to some sort of strategy that's aimed at achieving a good outcome. I mean, maybe if you had a slightly unusual conception of the good, if you thought the best thing in the world was understanding philosophy, then you could rationalize coming along to a lecture. But if you thought the most important thing is maximizing human flourishing and minimizing suffering, there's almost always something else we could be doing to pursue that goal, right? So if you have a maximizing conception of consequentialism, it ends up sort of colonizing and occupying every area of your life. And it starts to look really over-demanding. That way we said at the start that an over-demanding ethical theory looks implausible because we just can't live up to its requirements. So an alternative approach that's been developed is what's sometimes called satisficing consequentialism. I bet most of you could auto-generate a rough definition of what satisficing consequentialism is, given the problems that we've just been describing. You begin with an account of what's good and bad. So far, it's just the same as every other consequentialist theory. You say that right actions promote the good thing, but it's right as long as it promotes it up to a certain level. So you don't have to maximize the good in order to act rightly. You just have to reach some level in promoting it. And then wrong actions are any ones that don't quite reach that level. So think about giving away money. Every consequentialist is going to agree that if you have some money that you could give away to a good cause and you just hoard it all for yourself, that that's wrong. And every consequentialist is going to agree that if you take all the money that you don't need for your own survival and give it to good causes and benefit other people, that that's good, that's right. Do nothing, that's wrong. Do everything you could possibly do, that's right. Where the maximizer and the satisficer are going to disagree is in the middle ground case, where, say, you give away 20% of your money to good causes. The satisficer is going to say, yep, that's a pretty good effort. You did the right thing. You could have done more, but nevertheless, you did enough in order for your action to count as a right action. Whereas the maximizer is going to say, that's not right action because you didn't maximize the good. You could have done more to promote the good, right? So maximizers and satisficers are going to disagree about cases like this. Now, I mean, there are maximizing consequentialists, but because of these worries about over-demandingness, lots of consequentialists favour something like this satisficing approach nowadays. Okay, problem case. What should the consequentialist say in the following case? You've got a hostage negotiator, Ali. She's been doing this for years. She's really good at her job. There's a hostage negotiation situation unfolding. She knows that if she just lets things run its course and sort of settle into a stalemate, then eventually the SWAT team is going to have to storm the building. And statistically, based on all the times she's done this before, the likelihood is that if the SWAT team storms the building, 2 people will get killed. But there's another strategy she could follow, which is to launch a surprise attack. And it's a bit of a gamble. If she launches a surprise attack at the first moment, there's a 90% chance that she'll catch the hostage taker off guard and they'll be able to apprehend him and no one will get killed. But there's a 10% chance that the hostage taker is going to have an explosive device and react suddenly, and that will result in 5 people being killed. So it's a gamble. Now, Ali weighs the odds and she decides to go for the surprise attack. And unfortunately, it's one of the unlucky cases where this results in, an explosive device goes off and 5 people get killed. So, did Ali act rightly according to a consequentialist? Right actions are about promoting the best consequences. Did Ali get this one right or wrong?
Depends on the expected value.
So do you want to just unpack that thought a little bit?
You can calculate the expected value of the second option.
Yep.
0.9 times 20 plus 0.1 times 15 or whatever.
Yep.
Calculate
Yeah. Yeah. And if you do it that way, it looks like she made the right choice. So here's the comparison. Ali made a choice which resulted in 5 people being killed. If she'd not done that, if she'd just let it run to a stalemate, only 2 people have been killed. So she chose a course of action that led to a worse outcome. And therefore, if we interpret consequentialism at face value, it sounds like she's done the wrong thing. But there's a perspective from which it seems like she made a good choice, which is what this gent here was saying. So think about if you had 10 hostage negotiations a year that had this same structure. If every time you had a hostage negotiation, you let it run to a stalemate, at the end of the year, how many people would have been killed? 20, right? Whereas if every time you decided to do the surprise attack, how many people would you expect to have been killed at the end of the year? 5. Right? Because it's a 1 in 10 chance. So on one of those occasions, you expect that it will go badly, and the other 9, no one will be killed. So it seems like she made a rational calculation, a calculation that's going to result in fewer people being killed in the long run, if that's the strategy she generally adopts. But the strict definition of consequentialism says she took a course of action that resulted in a worse outcome, so she's done the wrong thing. How do we resolve this? We don't really want to say she's done the wrong thing if she made an entirely rational and appropriate strategic choice. So the response to this that consequentialists have generally favoured is to go subjective, right? To define right action not in terms of what in fact is the outcome of your choice, but what you could reasonably anticipate to be the outcome of your choice, right? Or to use the sort of rational choice theory terms, the expected utility of the option that you chose. And you should choose the option that has the highest expected utility. And if you do choose that option, you acted rightly, even if you get a bit unlucky and the results turn out worse. So we judge right action based on the subjective perspective of the person making the choice and the reasonable expectations that they could have. We can't know the future. It seems really crazy to say that someone acted wrongly just because they couldn't, omnisciently predict the future. So subjective consequentialism is an attempt to get around that worry. Okay, let's talk about theories of the good and intrinsic goodness. So I said before, if you're a consequentialist, your theory of the good is your theory of the right is parasitic on your theory of the good. You have a theory of here's what's good, here's what's bad, and then right action is defined in terms of promoting the good stuff or minimizing the bad stuff. The best known consequentialist theory is the one I mentioned before, classical utilitarianism. That there is Jeremy Bentham, famous 19th century English philosopher and proponent of classical utilitarianism. It has a really, really simple theory of the good. It says pleasure is good and pain is bad. Nowadays, there's not too many classical utilitarians around. A lot of people have sort of parted ways with the classical utilitarians on this theory of the good. Let me give you a sense of why people don't generally gravitate towards this view anymore. They think about cases like this. Suppose you're plugged into the Matrix. Or suppose you get abducted by an evil scientist who puts a bunch of electrodes in your head or hypnotizes you or gives you drugs that cause you to always feel happy, pleasurable states. But meanwhile, you're being robbed and locked up and tied up and you experience pleasure all the time, but your life is going really, really badly. None of us would want that to happen to us, except there is that one guy in the Matrix who chooses the red pill. But we're supposed to think, he's like an idiot for choosing that, right? Is it the red? I can't remember which pill he chooses. He chooses the pill that his, narrative expectations tell us he shouldn't have chosen that pill. Most of us think your life goes badly if you're living in a delusional dream world and it's really, really happy. Another example of this is the science fiction novel Brave New World, where there are all these people who are basically slaves, but they're drugged to the eyeballs with like happy drugs that cause them to be glad that they're slaves, right? Again, just experiencing pleasure, if your life in an objective sense is going really, really badly, doesn't seem intuitively appealing. So nowadays, people who sort of favour a utilitarian way of thinking about ethics want a somewhat more complicated theory of welfare or human good that's to do with certain kinds of objectively good states of affairs being realised, or having your preferences satisfied, or having a certain kind of autonomous life, or things like that. In theory, you could identify anything as the good and put it at the centre of your consequentialist ethical view. So you could have a really ridiculous, idiosyncratic ethical theory that said, the good is the Melbourne Football Club winning the premiership as often as they possibly can. And an action is right if it promotes that outcome, and it's wrong if it inhibits that outcome. But that would be, obviously a spurious ethical theory. We want an ethical theory that is the kind of thing that everyone in principle could subscribe to and take seriously. So the different theories of the good have generally been different attempts to try to describe some universally appreciable ideal that we could all say, yes, we should be trying to promote that. So some other things that could be seen as fundamental goods, the one I mentioned before was satisfied preferences. You might think that the best world is the one in which the maximum number of preferences are satisfied. Or you might have some richer conception of flourishing, which is not just about experiencing pleasure, but which is about experiencing, pleasures of a certain high caliber, like rational pleasures, pleasures that are based on non-delusional experiences of the world or something like that. What's important to have in mind, though, when you're thinking about how you define the good that's at the core of your consequentialist theory is that it's supposed to be something that's intrinsically good. Now, this is a slightly technical idea, and we could spend, literally hours talking about it, but I think I can give you the gist of the idea in just a few sentences. An intrinsic good is the opposite of an extrinsic good. And an extrinsic good is something which is good because of the relation that it stands in to something else. So think about money. Is money good in and of itself? Is it good to have a big pit of money that you can swim around in like Scrooge McDuck? Is it good to have a bank balance with lots and lots of zeros on it in and of itself? Most of us don't think so. We think whatever good money is, it's good because of what it can be used for. It can get you things that will make you happy. It can allow you to buy gifts for people that you love. You can donate it to worthy causes. And there's all these things that money is useful for. Or think about food, right? Imagine a universe where there are just plates of gourmet food floating through a void. Is that a good universe? Most of us normally wouldn't think so. We think food is good because it brings us pleasure, or it gives us nutrition and it helps our, health, right? Things like money and food are usually understood as extrinsically good. They're things that are good because of what they result in or what they promote. Whereas, suppose someone says to you, why is happiness good? You might find yourself just blanking and say, well, happiness is not good because of anything else. It's just good. It's just good, as we might say, in itself or for its own sake. So when consequentialists are coming up with a theory of the good, they want the concepts that they appeal to occupy their theory of the good to be things that could plausibly be regarded as intrinsically valuable. And that's going to rule some things out of contention and other things in. It's going to mean that just because something seems deep and important and rich and special, it's not automatically, for that reason, a candidate for being the central part of your ethical theory. So when you think about what's deep and important, an answer that often occurs to us is love. Love is the most important, or at least one of the most important parts of human life, right? But there's a kind of a plausible story to tell about why love is good. Love is good because it makes life better, because it brings us pleasure and joy, and sort of there's something more fundamental that we can appeal to explain why love is good, right? Now, we could argue about that particular case, but the point I'm trying to make is when you're coming up with your theory of the good, you have to focus on this idea of intrinsic goodness, and that sort of has a bearing on which things can be taken seriously as kind of central elements in your theory of the good. Okay, let me talk briefly about something. I'm going to really race through this section because I want to talk about cake and whiskey in a minute. So I'm going to race through the upsides of consequentialism and get to the cake and whiskey. A good thing about consequentialism, a reason people like it, is because it's flexible. You often find yourself in a situation where you've made a promise or you've been committed to some standard, and violating that promise or reneging on that standard would mean things go better. Think about the desert island case that Smart talked about before. I made this guy a promise, but I can do much more benefit if I renege on that promise and give this money to a different organisation. And people who, in those sorts of situations, refuse to be flexible sometimes seem irrationally stubborn. I can't give you money, I'm sorry, Adelaide Hospital, I know you need X-ray machines to, help people with really serious tumours, but I promised it to the jockeys. And they say, the jockeys have got everything they need. The jockeys are fine. It's like, yeah, but I made a promise. People who think that way often seem really stubborn. And the consequentialist is the one who has the easiest time explaining why you should just be flexible in that case. Basically, you should keep your promises when it benefits things to keep your promises, and if it doesn't, you shouldn't. That's not an intuition that we follow in every single case, but it's an intuition that a lot of us have in some cases, and the consequentialist has a really easy time explaining why we should think that way, or why it's okay to think that way. Okay, another benefit, it accords with our intuitions about a very wide range of cases. So think about the kinds of ethical issues where we have strong and convergent intuitions about right and wrong action. Gratuitous killing, slavery, rescuing people when it's easy to do so, being gratuitously cruel. There are cases like this where pretty much everyone who gives the question any thought reaches a strong convergent intuition about what's right and wrong. And consequentialism has the benefit of delivering the correct verdict on all of these cases. All these cases where we have strong convergent intuitions are ones where the actions that we think are wrong are ones that have really, really bad consequences for human welfare. And the actions that we think are right have obviously good consequences for human welfare. So it seems to give, sort of deliver the right answer about a bunch of these cases. Okay, next attraction. Simplicity and parsimony. This is just the idea that consequentialism is a simpler theory than its rivals. Every ethical theory pays some attention to the consequences. But deontology pays attention to the consequences and all of this stuff about rights and duties. Virtue ethics pays attention to the consequences and all of this stuff about virtue and your intentions. So consequentialists don't have to worry about those other things. They've got a simpler theory. They can still explain why a bunch of our ethical intuitions stack up the way they do, but they have a simpler story to tell about why that is. As I said before, it's a general principle, at least in the natural sciences, that you should get, roughly speaking, the simplest theory that explains the most stuff, the most explanatory bang for your buck, a kind of Occam's razor type idea. And if we want to apply that principle when it comes to doing ethics, that seems like it's going to favour consequentialism over its rivals. Last benefit is this idea of impartiality. Just very briefly, consequentialist theories, the complexion, the intellectual temperament of being a consequentialist is like this. I see a convention, I reject a convention. I see an ethical habit or a social moray, I reject a habit or a social moray. I'm a maverick, I'm rejecting all of society's conventional rules because all I care about is promoting good consequences, even if that means violating every convention and expectation you've been following for the last however many years. And it's no accident that consequentialists have therefore been at the forefront of radical social movements that are about remedying structural oppression and structural inequality. John Stuart Mill, probably the most famous utilitarian of the 19th century, was a feminist before we even had the concept of feminism, right? He was arguably one of the first men to kind of defend feminism as an ideal. Jeremy Bentham, who was writing even earlier than Mill in the start of the 19th century, thought something which in his society was like an absolutely crazy thing, which is that we should tolerate people with unconventional sexual preferences. Some people, are still really wound up about that. Bentham thought this 200 years ago, before anyone thought this way. Peter Singer, who's a present-day utilitarian, has been at the forefront of the animal liberation, animal ethics movement. This is not an accident. This is something that attracts people towards consequentialism, is that it has this kind of radical iconoclastic vibe about it. Okay, I have 7 minutes. Cake and whiskey. I Googled cake and whiskey last night, and this was the first image result, and it was perfect. Who likes cake? Hands for cake. Hands for whiskey. Hands for cake and whiskey. All right, my people. Let's keep our hands in the air as a sign of our adulation. All right, I like cake and whiskey, but I'm pretty sure I consume too much of both. Why am I disclosing this to you? I'm here to teach you, not talk about my dietary woes. All right, it is relevant, I promise you. Suppose you're thinking about your diet in the way that a consequentialist thinks about all their choices. So you should eat the things that are going to promote your happiness or your welfare, and you should avoid eating things that are going to result in suffering, your own suffering or other people's. Seems like a pretty good way to think about making your choices about what you eat. Should you eat cake and drink whiskey? Well, cake and whiskey promote happiness in the short term. I have a smile on my face when I'm consuming them, but also if I do it all the time, I'm going to get diabetes or heart disease, and I might become an alcoholic, and it could result in suffering in the long term. Okay, so how should I decide what to do on a case-by-case, day-to-day basis? Every day I wake up and I'm feeling a bit like bored or out of it, like, oh, maybe I should eat some cake to make today better, right? What should I do? Should I try to calculate the costs and benefits of eating cake today or drinking whiskey tonight? There's this real worry about trying to calculate costs and benefits on a day-to-day basis. The problem is, and I'm linking it back to consequentialism now, a consequentialist approach tells us to do whatever best promotes the good. But for a bunch of complicated psychological reasons about the sort of biases we have, the sort of heuristics we use to make decisions, some weird like animal parts of our brain that make us respond certain ways to certain situations, we're actually, in many cases, really bad at making sound judgments about what promotes the good. Right? So I can easily think, look, cake is going to make me happy today, and I'm not going to have it every day. I'm just going to have it today, so I'll eat some cake. But then the problem is, I could do that, you know, and indeed some people do that literally every day. And it ends up being the source of suffering in their life. You could say this for whiskey, you could say this for drugs. Of course, there's lots of things for which this is true. So we often find that we're much better off when we're thinking about trying to make good dietary choices, following some simple mechanical rules, like something like eat lean meat and vegetables for most meals, and then only have cake and whiskey once a fortnight. You know, special occasions only, and mostly you should just follow this. And following that rule rigidly, not calculating the costs and benefits day in, day out about the different courses of action, just following the rule. This sometimes serves us better. In fact, this often serves us better, and that's why most diets are about, here are some rules, just stick to these rules. Okay, so that's a really trivial case. Now let me give you a really serious case where the same sort of structure reveals itself. This is an actual photo of a man being tortured by the US military. So after the US invaded Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11 to try to unearth all of these terrorist networks, they kind of started torturing people. And this is a photo of a guy being electrocuted and humiliated and stuff like that. Okay, torture is obviously like a pressing and difficult moral issue. What's it got to do with eating cake and whiskey? The structure of it is actually similar. Suppose you follow a simple consequentialist ethical approach to questions about torturing people. In other words, your rough policy is torture people only in those cases where it's going to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. So if you've got really, really good reasons to think that, yes, this person's going to have a lot of pain inflicted on them, but that will enable us to prevent a really bad outcome and save a lot of lives, you're only justified in doing it in those cases. That's a simple consequentialist way to approach this question. Torture inflicts suffering in the short term, but it can have a benefit in the long term. Okay, the question still remains for the consequentialists. How are you going to make your decisions? And actually, the point about cake and whiskey applies here too. This is exactly the same text as on the previous slide. Consequentialism tells us to do whatever best promotes the good, but for various complex psychological reasons, we're often really bad at making sound judgments about what promotes the good. We rationalize choices. We get caught up in a certain way of thinking about an issue, and then we can't, have our mind changed by evidence. So again, we're often much better off following a mechanical rule, like never torture anyone ever, even if it seems like this will result in better outcomes in a particular case, rather than trying to calculate costs and benefits on a case-by-case basis. This worry that we're bad at calculating the costs and benefits is something that consequentialists have spent a lot of time thinking about. Their ethical theory says the right action is the one that has the best consequences. It seems very natural then that you're going to approach decision-making by trying to calculate the consequences and costs and benefits and choosing the best one. But we're really bad at making those calculations soundly. There's so many different ways that can go wrong. So, because of this, consequentialists can, and nowadays mostly do, separate the question from how we decide whether an action's right or wrong and how we decide what we're actually going to do in this particular case. Here's a quote from the Pettit article. Pettit's article, those of you who've read it will know, he sort of has quite a lot of substance in it about this particular problem. He says, a consequentialist theory is an account of what justifies an option over the alternatives, namely the fact that it promotes the relevant value. It's not an account of how agents ought to deliberate. Indirect consequentialists are people who think we should choose how to act by some method other than calculating the consequences, even though they think that what makes an action right is that it promotes the best consequences. What makes an action right is that it promotes the good, but how should you decide to act? Well, don't try to calculate what promotes the good, because you'll probably muck it up. What should you do instead? Well, there's different kinds of answers. Maybe you should follow some rules, some heuristics or some general rules of thumb that we've got independent reasons to think make things go well. Maybe you should defer to the advice of wise people. Maybe you should just act on gut instinct. But whatever you do, don't choose how to act by doing these calculations and cost-benefit calculations, because you'll muck it up. That's an indirect consequentialist approach. We're out of time. Next week I'm going to pick us up right at this point and say a little bit more about how that approach might work in practice and some of the problems that it faces. And then, sorry, we just missed 2 slides. And then we'll move on to talk about a few more bigger overarching objections to consequentialism besides this indirect versus direct consequentialism. The essay topics and instructions are now up online, so go and have a look at those sometime soon and get in contact with me or your tutor if you've got any questions. And expository exercise results will be returned next week. All right, thanks everyone. I'll see you next week. Consequentialism is this fancy. There's really only one interesting method in the family. Yeah, I mean, there are different kinds of utilitarian theories, which are basically how to very but yeah, I mean, there is someone who has like one or two wacky
so like which act in which the consequences show you as